When I saw my husband scrolling through my phone, my heart skipped a beat, but not from fear of being caught. It was from knowing he would see those messages. The ones I forgot to delete. I tried to snatch the phone from his hands, but he pulled it back and kept reading. I watched his face change as he read line by line, feeling my life crumble in seconds. Yes, now he would learn the truth. But not the whole truth. His hands trembled as he scrolled further, and I knew, any moment now he would reach that message that would destroy my life. The one that would explain everything and put a final period. Or maybe confuse him even more. My phone suddenly vibrated in his hands, and a new notification appeared on the screen. I saw his face go pale as he read the sender's name. My husband froze. Didn't even blink. I bit the inside of my cheek, an old habit when I'm nervous. My nerves mixed with the horror of realizing what I had done. His breathing quickened. I could hear it even from the 2 meters separating us. This was exactly what I feared most. Because 3 months ago I made a mistake, the kind of mistake that changed absolutely everything, and now. I didn't know what to do, but let me tell you how it really happened. Before I share with you the secret I tried so carefully to hide for so long, write in the comments what city you're watching this video from, and answer this question: have you ever had a secret you tried desperately to hide, but in the end, you couldn't keep it? Looking back, I should have known something was different the moment we pulled into the gravel driveway of the countryside house. The way my husband's stepfather emerged from the front door, wiping his hands on a kitchen towel, smiling at us both but somehow focusing just a fraction longer on me. At 47, I had grown accustomed to being invisible in social situations, the dutiful wife who nodded at appropriate moments and asked polite questions about gardens and weather. But Harold saw me. Really saw me. "Welcome, welcome," he called out, his voice carrying that warm authority that comes from a lifetime of making people feel at ease. My husband David immediately launched into apologies about the traffic, the late arrival, the forgotten bottle of wine we were supposed to bring. Harold waved it all away with the kind of grace that made David's fussing seem petty by comparison. I had met Harold only twice before, at our wedding 8 years ago, and at David's mother's funeral 3 years later. Both times, he had been kind but distant, the grieving widower who remarried late in life and kept mostly to himself. David rarely spoke about him except in the context of obligation, the way one might mention a distant relative who required occasional attention. The house itself was a revelation. I had expected something modest, perhaps slightly shabby around the edges. Instead, Harold had created a sanctuary. Every room flowed naturally into the next, filled with books, artwork, and the kind of comfortable furniture that invited long conversations. Wind chimes sang softly on the wraparound porch, and through the kitchen window, I could see a vegetable garden that spoke of patience and care. "Your room is upstairs, second door on the right," Harold said, carrying our bags despite David's protests. "I thought we'd have dinner on the porch tonight. The sunset here is something special." David was already checking his phone, muttering about poor cell reception and important emails. I found myself watching Harold arrange fresh flowers in a vase, his movements deliberate and thoughtful. When he caught me looking, he smiled. "I hope you don't mind simple food," he said. "I've gotten used to cooking for one." "Simple food sounds perfect," I replied, and meant it. At home, David preferred restaurants where he could conduct business over meals, or take out eaten while reviewing spreadsheets. The idea of a home-cooked meal, eaten slowly and without agenda, felt luxurious. That evening, as promised, we gathered on the porch as the sun painted the sky in shades of amber and rose. Harold had prepared salmon with herbs from his garden, roasted vegetables, and a simple salad that somehow tasted better than anything I'd eaten in months. David spent most of the meal fielding work calls, stepping into the house whenever his phone rang. "I'm sorry about this," I said during one of his absences. He promised to disconnect for the week. Harold refilled my wine glass, his fingers briefly brushing mine as he handed it back. Work has a way of expanding to fill all available space, he said. Sometimes we forget there are other ways to spend our time. The simple observation hit deeper than it should have. When had I last spent time without agenda, without purpose, without the constant hum of productivity? Even this vacation had been scheduled around David's work calendar, timed to coincide with a lighter period in his accounting practice. "What do you do when you're not working?" Harold asked. The question caught me off guard. No one had asked me that in years. I used to paint, I said slowly. Watercolors, mostly. Landscapes. Used to? Life got busy. David's practice grew, we bought a bigger house, there were always projects, obligations. I trailed off, realizing how hollow it sounded. Harold nodded thoughtfully. I retired from teaching 5 years ago. Literature professor for 32 years. I thought I'd miss it more than I do, but I've discovered there's something to be said for unstructured time. For following curiosity instead of curriculum. When David returned, apologizing again, the conversation shifted to safer topics, the weather, local history, plans for the week. But I found myself studying Harold's face in the lamplight, noticing the laugh lines around his eyes, the careful way he listened when David spoke, the patience he showed for interruptions and diversions. Later, as David and I settled into the guest room, he was already planning the next day's agenda. Dad mentioned some hiking trails. Good for networking when I get back, clients love outdoor adventure stories. And there's that antique shop in town you might enjoy. I lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the sounds of a countryside night, wind through trees, the distant call of an owl, the soft settling of an old house. Beside me, David's breathing had already settled into the rhythm of deep sleep. Through the thin walls, I could hear Harold moving around downstairs, the gentle clink of dishes being washed, the whisper of pages turning. For the first time in months, I felt awake. The next morning arrived with the kind of golden light that makes everything look like a painting. I woke to find David already on a conference call in the living room, his laptop balanced on his knees, speaking in the clipped tones he reserved for difficult clients. Harold was in the kitchen, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who had perfected the art of solitary mornings. "Coffee," he offered, gesturing toward a French press that was clearly a step above the instant coffee David and I usually shared. "Please," I said, accepting the warm mug gratefully. The kitchen smelled of fresh bread and something herbal, rosemary, perhaps, or thyme from the garden. "I thought I might run to the farmer's market this morning," Harold said, consulting a handwritten list. "Local produce, fresh bread. You're welcome to join me, unless you prefer to rest." Through the window, I could see David pacing the porch, his voice rising as he explained something to whoever was on the other end of his call. The idea of sitting on the porch, waiting for him to finish, while the morning slipped away, felt suddenly unbearable. "I'd love to come," I said. Harold's truck was old but well-maintained, the kind of vehicle that suggested priorities other than status or impression. As we drove through countryside that seemed untouched by hurry, he pointed out landmarks, the century-old oak where local teenagers still carved initials, the bend in the creek where he'd learned to fish as a boy visiting his own grandmother. "You grew up here?" I asked. "Summers, mostly. My parents thought city kids needed country wisdom." He smiled. "I think they just needed a break from their precocious son who read too much and asked too many questions." The farmer's market was exactly what such places should be, clusters of weathered tables under colorful awnings, vendors who knew each other's names and stories, the kind of unhurried commerce that valued conversation as much as currency. Harold moved through it like someone who belonged, greeting the woman selling honey, examining tomatoes with the serious attention of someone who understood the difference between good and exceptional. I found myself watching his hands as he selected peaches, testing for ripeness with a gentleness that spoke of experience. When had I last touched food with such consideration? At home, shopping was an efficiency exercise, lists organized by store layout, familiar brands grabbed without thought, meals planned around convenience rather than pleasure. "Try this," Harold said, offering me a slice of peach from the sample plate. Our fingers touched briefly as I took it, and I was surprised by the small electric shock of contact. The peach was perfect, sweet, juicy, tasting of sunshine and summer in a way that made grocery store fruit seem like a pale imitation. "That's beautiful," I said. "Worth the drive, isn't it?" He was looking at me rather than the fruit, and something in his expression made my cheeks warm. We filled his canvas bags with treasures, vegetables still wearing traces of earth, bread that would never see the inside of a plastic wrapper, flowers cut that morning from someone's cutting garden. At the honey stand, the elderly woman mentioned Harold's late wife, how she used to buy lavender honey for her tea. Harold accepted the condolences with grace, but I saw the slight tightening around his eyes. As we loaded the truck, storm clouds gathered with the swift drama that comes with afternoon weather. The first fat raindrops began falling just as we reached the cab, and by the time we were on the road, rain was drumming against the windshield with increasing intensity. "There's a covered bridge about a mile ahead," Harold said, squinting through the downpour. "We should wait it out." The bridge was a piece of local history, its weathered wooden sides providing perfect shelter from the sudden storm. Harold turned off the engine, and we sat in the cocoon of the truck cab, listening to rain on the roof, watching water stream past the open sides of the bridge. "I haven't been caught in the rain like this in years," I said, laughing at the absurdity of it. At home, I would have checked the weather forecast, planned accordingly, avoided such inconvenience. "Sometimes the best experiences are the ones we don't plan," Harold said softly. I turned to look at him, struck by something in his tone. He was watching the rain, but I had the sense he was talking about more than weather. The silence stretched between us, filled with the sound of water and wind and something else, a kind of awareness that made the air in the truck feel charged. "I should tell you," he said finally, still looking straight ahead. "This is the most I've talked to another person in months. Since Margaret died, I've gotten used to my own company. But with you, conversation feels natural again." The admission hung between us like a bridge I could choose to cross or ignore. I knew the safe response, something about how nice it was to get away from the city, how peaceful the countryside seemed. Instead, I heard myself saying, "I know what you mean. Sometimes I go entire days without saying anything that matters to anyone." He turned to look at me then, really look, and I felt seen in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. When had David last looked at me like this, as if I were a person worth discovering rather than a familiar piece of furniture? The rain began to slow, but neither of us moved to start the engine. In the green-tinted light filtering through the bridge, with the sound of water still pattering around us, Harold reached over and touched my hand where it rested on the seat between us. "Thank you," he said. "For coming today. For being here." I should have pulled my hand away. Should have made a joke about the weather, changed the subject, re-established the appropriate boundaries between stepfather-in-law and daughter-in-law. Instead, I turned my palm up to meet his, and when he leaned toward me, I didn't pull back. We kissed. It was soft, tentative, lasting only a moment before we both realized what we had done. Harold pulled back first, his eyes wide with something between wonder and dismay. "I'm sorry," he began, but I shook my head. "Don't," I said. "Don't apologize. Not yet." We drove home in silence, but it wasn't the uncomfortable silence of regret. It was the silence of two people who had just discovered something unexpected and were trying to understand what it meant. The next 3 days passed in a strange suspension of normalcy, like living inside a snow globe that someone had shaken and was waiting to settle. David, blissfully unaware, continued his pattern of morning conference calls and afternoon emails, treating the countryside house like a remote office with better views. Harold and I moved around each other with careful politeness, our conversation limited to safe topics, the weather, meal plans, David's work schedule. But underneath the ordinary surface, everything had changed. I became hyper-aware of Harold's presence in ways that felt both thrilling and dangerous. The sound of his footsteps on the wooden floors made my pulse quicken. When he handed me a cup of coffee, I found myself studying his hands, remembering the gentle certainty with which they had touched mine. During family dinners on the porch, I caught myself watching his mouth as he spoke, remembering how it had felt against mine for those few electric seconds in the covered bridge. The guilt should have been overwhelming. I was a married woman who had kissed her husband's stepfather. I was staying in Harold's house under the assumption of family loyalty and respect. I was betraying David's trust in the most fundamental way possible. Instead, I felt more awake than I had in years. "You seem different here," David commented on the third evening as we got ready for bed. "More relaxed. Maybe we should consider buying a place in the country." The irony of his observation wasn't lost on me. "It's peaceful," I agreed, avoiding his eyes in the bathroom mirror. "Dad seems to enjoy having us." I was worried he might be getting too isolated out here. Good to see him engaging socially again. If only he knew how engaged Harold and I had become, I thought with a mixture of shame and dark humor. But David's attention was already shifting to his phone, scrolling through tomorrow's agenda. I lay awake that night listening to the now familiar sounds of the house settling around us. Somewhere below, Harold was probably reading in his study, the room lined with books that spoke of a lifetime spent with ideas and words. I imagined him in his leather chair, lamplight falling across the pages, and felt a longing so sharp it made my chest ache. What was I doing? What did I want from this impossible situation? The answer came to me with uncomfortable clarity. I wanted to feel alive again. I wanted to be seen as more than just David's wife, the woman who managed his social calendar and remembered to send birthday cards to his clients. I wanted conversation that went deeper than grocery lists and vacation logistics. I wanted to remember what it felt like to be desired for my thoughts, my laugh, my particular way of seeing the world. Harold offered all of that, and the knowledge was as terrifying as it was exhilarating. The next morning brought a shift in the household dynamic. David received a call from his largest client, some crisis requiring his immediate attention and expertise. He spent an hour on the phone, pacing the porch with increasing agitation. "I might need to drive back to the city," he announced over breakfast. "Just for a day or two. This situation with the Henderson account can't wait until next week." Harold set down his coffee cup carefully. "Of course. Family emergencies take precedence." "It's not family, Dad. It's work. There's a difference." The gentle rebuke in Harold's expression was so subtle I might have missed it if I hadn't been watching him so intently. "Of course there is," he said mildly. David spent the rest of the morning making arrangements, his energy focused entirely on solving problems and managing expectations. He barely looked at me except to ask if I wanted to drive back with him. "I think I'll stay," I heard myself saying. "If that's all right with Harold. The change of pace has been good for me." David nodded distractedly. "Probably better. I'll be working around the clock anyway. No point in both of us having a ruined vacation." As his car disappeared down the gravel drive, I felt the house exhale around us. Harold and I stood on the porch, watching the dust settle, neither of us speaking about what David's absence meant. "I should probably start dinner," Harold said finally. "I'll help," I offered. We worked side by side in the kitchen, preparing a simple meal of pasta and vegetables from the farmer's market. The easy rhythm of shared tasks, chopping, stirring, tasting, felt more intimate than any conversation we'd had. When Harold reached around me to retrieve a spice from the cabinet, his body briefly pressed against mine, and I felt that same electric awareness that had preceded our kiss in the bridge. "We should talk about what happened," he said softly, not moving away. I turned in the circle of his arms, close enough to see the conflict in his eyes. "Should we? You're married to my stepson." "I know. This could destroy everything." "I know that too." He studied my face, searching for something, regret, maybe, or fear that would give him permission to step back from whatever this was becoming. Instead, he found only honesty. "I can't promise this is wise," he said. "I'm not asking for promises." This time, when he kissed me, there was nothing tentative about it. This time, we both knew exactly what we were choosing. David's absence stretched from 1 day to 3, each phone call bringing news of additional complications that required his personal attention. I listened to his increasingly frazzled updates with what I hoped sounded like appropriate concern, all while living in a parallel reality where time moved differently and ordinary moments carried extraordinary weight. Harold and I had crossed a line, and there was no pretending otherwise. But rather than rushing headlong into reckless passion, we found ourselves moving with careful deliberation, like two people learning a new and intricate dance. Every interaction was charged with awareness, every casual touch a small electric shock that reminded us how the landscape between us had shifted. We took long walks through the countryside, ostensibly exploring local history but really just stealing time to talk without the weight of the house around us. Harold told me about his years teaching, about students who had challenged his assumptions and colleagues who had become lifelong friends. I found myself sharing things I hadn't spoken about in years, my abandoned dreams of art school, the gradual way I had let myself become smaller to fit into David's vision of what a wife should be. "Why did you stop painting?" Harold asked as we sat beside a creek, watching water move over stones with the patient persistence of time itself. David thought it was impractical. Too messy, too unpredictable. He needed someone who could support his career, manage the social obligations, keep things organized. I picked up a smooth stone, turning it over in my palm. I convinced myself that being a good wife was enough. And now? The question hung between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. Now I wonder what would have happened if I'd been brave enough to be impractical. Harold reached over and took the stone from my hand, examining it in the afternoon light. "It's not too late, you know. To be brave." That evening, we cooked dinner together again, moving around each other with increasing familiarity. Harold opened a bottle of wine, something special he'd been saving, he said, though he didn't specify for what occasion. We ate slowly, talking about books and travel and the small observations that accumulate when you're paying attention to life instead of just managing it. "I keep thinking I should feel guilty," I admitted as we cleared the dishes. "Do you?" I considered the question honestly. I feel like I should feel guilty. But mostly I feel awake. Like I've been sleepwalking for years and suddenly I can see clearly. Harold dried a plate with careful attention, his movements deliberate and thoughtful. "Margaret and I had 43 years together. Good years, mostly. But even in the best marriages, there are things left unsaid, roads not taken. After she died, I thought that was it for me. That I'd had my chance at connection and shouldn't be greedy enough to expect another." He set the plate in the cabinet and turned to face me. "But then you arrived, and suddenly I remembered what it felt like to want to know everything about another person. To want to share all the small discoveries that make up a day." The kitchen fell silent except for the tick of the old clock on the wall and the distant sound of wind through trees. We stood facing each other across the space that had somehow become charged with possibility, and I knew we had reached another moment of choice. David will be back tomorrow, I said. I know. This will become more complicated. I know that too. Harold moved closer, until he could reach out and touch my face with the same gentleness he'd shown the peaches at the market. But right now, it's just us. Right now, we get to choose what this moment means. When he kissed me this time, it was with the certainty of someone who had stopped fighting against what he wanted. I kissed him back with months of suppressed longing, years of feeling invisible and unheard. The kiss deepened, and I felt myself letting go of the careful control that had governed my life for so long. We broke apart, breathing hard, foreheads touching, both of us trembling slightly from the intensity of connection. I should go upstairs, I whispered, though I made no move to leave. You should, he agreed, though his hands remained gentle on my face. This is going to change everything. Everything was already changing, Harold said softly. From the moment you walked through that door, everything was already different. I kissed him again, and this time I wasn't thinking about tomorrow or consequences or the careful architecture of the life I'd built with David. This time I was thinking only about the man in front of me, about the way he saw me as someone worth knowing, worth choosing, worth the risk of turning a safe world upside down. When we finally pulled apart, I knew there would be no going back to the woman I'd been a week ago. That woman was disappearing like morning mist, leaving behind someone I wasn't sure I recognized but was eager to discover. Tomorrow would bring David home and all the complications that came with him. Tonight was ours, and whatever happened next, I would not regret claiming this moment of being fully, completely alive. The house felt different that night, as if the walls themselves had shifted to accommodate this new reality we were creating. Harold walked me to the bottom of the stairs, his hand warm and steady in mine, both of us moving with the careful deliberation of people who understood the magnitude of what we were choosing. Are you certain? He asked softly, his thumb tracing gentle circles across my knuckles. I looked into his eyes, seeing my own reflection there, flushed, breathless, alive in a way I'd almost forgotten was possible. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. We climbed the stairs together, past the guest room where David's belongings still lay scattered across the dresser, past the bathroom where his toothbrush stood in its holder like a small monument to ordinary married life. Harold's room was at the end of the hall, filled with moonlight and the scent of lavender from the garden below. We spent the night together. I woke before dawn, disoriented by unfamiliar surroundings and the warm presence beside me. Harold slept peacefully, his face relaxed in a way that made him look younger, and I allowed myself the luxury of studying him in the gray pre-dawn light. His hair was silver white against the pillow, and there were lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent laughing, worrying, living fully. This was a man who had loved deeply before, who understood both the joy and the cost of opening one's heart completely. The reality of what we had done settled over me gradually, like morning mist. I was lying in bed with my husband's stepfather. I had crossed every line that defined proper behavior, shattered every promise I had made on my wedding day. The woman who had arrived at this house a week ago would have been horrified by my actions. Instead, I felt a deep sense of rightness, as if all the scattered pieces of myself had finally clicked into place. Harold stirred beside me, his eyes opening to meet mine with immediate awareness. No confusion, no regret, just quiet acknowledgement of where we were and what it meant. Good morning, he whispered, his voice rough with sleep. Good morning. We lay in silence for a few moments, listening to the house wake up around us, floorboards settling, birds beginning their morning conversations, the distant sound of a delivery truck on the main road. Normal sounds of a normal day, except nothing about this day would be normal. David will be back this afternoon, I said finally. Harold nodded, his expression growing thoughtful. Yes. We'll need to be careful. The word hung between us, loaded with implications. Careful about what, exactly? Our behavior around David? Our feelings for each other? The way we looked at each other across the dinner table? All of it, I realized. Everything would require careful management now. I slipped back to the guest room before the house was fully awake, moving through the hallway like a thief stealing moments that belonged to someone else. In the bathroom mirror, I examined my reflection for signs of what had happened, some visible mark of transformation. My hair was mussed, my lips slightly swollen, but otherwise I looked remarkably like the woman I had always been. The changes were all internal, a loosening of something that had been held too tightly, a brightness in my eyes that had been absent for years. David called during breakfast to confirm his return time and apologize again for cutting the vacation short. His voice sounded tinny and distant through Harold's old landline, and I found myself studying Harold's face as he spoke to his stepson with perfect normalcy. "She's been wonderful company," Harold said, his eyes meeting mine across the kitchen table. "I think the countryside agrees with her." After Harold hung up, we moved around each other with new awareness, every casual touch electric with memory. When he handed me a cup of coffee, our fingers lingered just a moment too long. When I reached past him to get something from the cabinet, I let my hand rest briefly on his shoulder, feeling the warmth of his skin through his shirt. "We should probably discuss boundaries," Harold said as we worked together to clean the house before David's return. "How we want to handle this going forward." I paused in my folding of the throw blankets we'd shared on the porch. "Do you regret it?" "No." His answer came without hesitation. "Do you?" "No. But I'm terrified of what comes next." Harold set down the book he'd been straightening and came to stand beside me. "We don't have to have all the answers today. We just need to be honest with ourselves about what this means." What did it mean? I had spent one night with a man who wasn't my husband, but it felt like I had discovered an entirely new way of being in the world. Harold saw parts of me that David had never noticed, my curiosity about art, my need for deep conversation, my longing to be valued for more than my ability to manage a household efficiently. "I keep waiting to feel guilty," I admitted. "I know I should. But mostly I feel grateful." Harold touched my face gently, the same gesture that had preceded our first real kiss. "Guilt will come. It's inevitable when we disrupt the order of things. But gratitude is honest too. Maybe more honest than guilt." By noon, the house looked exactly as it had when David left, no trace of the seismic shift that had occurred in his absence. Harold and I had erased all evidence of our night together with the thoroughness of people who understood that some secrets required perfect execution. When David's car pulled into the driveway, I was on the porch reading, the picture of a wife who had spent her time in peaceful solitude. Harold emerged from his study, greeting his stepson with the warm familiarity they had always shared. Everything appeared exactly as it should be. Except for the way Harold's eyes found mine over David's shoulder, holding a promise and a question that only I could read. The afternoon passed in a strange suspension of normalcy. David unpacked, showered, and launched into detailed accounts of the crisis that had required his attention. I listened with appropriate interest, asking the right questions at the right moments, all while hyper-aware of Harold's presence in the room. When David mentioned staying an extra day to decompress before heading home, I felt both relief and panic. More time with Harold, but also more opportunity for David to notice the subtle changes in our dynamic. That evening, we had dinner on the porch as usual, but the easy rhythm of previous nights felt forced. David dominated the conversation with work stories, oblivious to the charged silence between Harold and me. When he excused himself to take a business call, Harold and I were left alone for the first time since that morning. "This is harder than I expected," I whispered. "The pretending?" "Everything. Sitting here listening to him talk about his day, knowing what we shared last night. It feels like living in two different worlds simultaneously." Harold reached across the table and touched my hand briefly, a gesture that could have been simple familial affection if David had been watching. "We'll figure it out. One day at a time." But even as he spoke the reassuring words, I could see the strain in his expression. This wasn't sustainable, the careful performance, the stolen glances, the weight of a secret that grew heavier with each passing hour. When David returned from his call, he seemed more relaxed than he'd been in days. "You know what? I think I needed this break more than I realized. Maybe we should consider making this an annual tradition, summer week at Dad's place." The suggestion hit me like a physical blow. Annual visits. Years of pretending, of careful distance, of living with the memory of one perfect night while maintaining the facade of appropriate family relationships. Harold's expression remained carefully neutral, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes. "You're always welcome here," he said simply. As we prepared for bed that night, David was unusually affectionate, pulling me close and commenting on how refreshed I seemed. "Country air agrees with you," he said, echoing Harold's words from that morning. "You seem more like yourself somehow." If only he knew how true that was, and how little that had to do with the country air. I lay awake long into the night, listening to David's peaceful breathing beside me, acutely aware that Harold was just down the hall. The distance between us felt both impossibly vast and dangerously small. Every creak of the house made me wonder if he was awake too, staring at the ceiling and trying to navigate this new reality we'd created. Tomorrow we would drive back to the city, back to our regular lives, and this week would become a memory to be carefully preserved and even more carefully hidden. But lying there in the darkness, I knew that nothing would ever be the same. Harold had awakened something in me that couldn't be put back to sleep, and I had no idea how to live with that knowledge while maintaining the life I'd built with David. The night stretched endlessly ahead, filled with questions I wasn't ready to answer and choices I wasn't prepared to make. David's energy the next morning was infectious, fueled by the prospect of returning to his familiar routines and the satisfaction of having successfully managed his work crisis from a distance. He packed efficiently, made lists of things to address when we got home, and chatted cheerfully about upcoming projects and social obligations. I moved through the morning like an actor who had forgotten her lines, going through the motions of departure while feeling increasingly disconnected from the woman David expected me to be. Harold maintained his role as the gracious host, helping carry bags to the car and accepting David's thanks for the hospitality with modest warmth. "You'll have to come visit us in the city soon," David said as we loaded the last of our belongings. "I know it's not as peaceful as this place, but we have that new restaurant I've been wanting to try." Harold nodded politely, but I caught the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. The idea of him sitting in one of David's preferred restaurants, all stainless steel and carefully curated atmosphere, discussing business trends over overpriced entrees felt like a violation of everything we had discovered together. When it came time for final goodbyes, I found myself frozen on the porch steps, unwilling to take the final step toward the car that would carry me away from this place and back to my old life. Harold embraced David first, a warm hug between family members who genuinely cared for each other despite their different approaches to life. Then he turned to me, and I saw everything we couldn't say reflected in his eyes: gratitude, longing, uncertainty about what came next. His hug lasted a beat longer than it should have, and I felt him press something small into my palm before releasing me. "Take care of yourself," he said softly, words that carried more weight than David could possibly understand. I climbed into the passenger seat with Harold's gift hidden in my closed fist, not daring to examine it until we were safely down the road. When I finally opened my hand, I found a smooth stone, the same one I had picked up by the creek, the one Harold had taken from me and examined in the afternoon light. He had kept it all this time, and now he was giving it back transformed into something more than just a piece of limestone. It was a token, a reminder, a promise that what had happened between us was real and worth preserving. The drive home passed in a blur of familiar scenery and David's cheerful commentary about getting back to normal life. He talked about client meetings scheduled for next week, dinner plans with friends, the contractor who was supposed to fix the back deck. All the comfortable details of our shared existence, but now they felt like items on someone else's to-do list. I held Harold's stone in my pocket, running my thumb over its smooth surface whenever David's chatter became too much to bear. The simple action grounded me, reminded me that I hadn't imagined the connection we'd shared. Whatever happened next, I had experienced something real and transformative, and that knowledge would be mine to keep. When we pulled into our driveway, I felt a strange sense of displacement, as if I were visiting someone else's house. Everything looked exactly as we had left it, the perfectly maintained lawn, the carefully arranged porch furniture, the newspapers stacked neatly by the front door, but it all felt somehow smaller, more constrained than I remembered. David was already planning the evening, suggesting we order from our usual Chinese restaurant and catch up on the television shows we'd missed. Normal couple activities for a normal evening, except I felt like I was watching someone else's life unfold around me. "You're quiet," David observed as we unpacked our bags in the bedroom. "Everything okay?" I forced a smile. "Just tired from the drive. It'll take me a day or two to readjust to city life." He accepted this explanation without question, which somehow made me feel even more isolated. The old me would have been grateful for his easy acceptance, his lack of probing questions. Now it felt like evidence of how little attention he paid to my inner landscape. That night, as David scrolled through his phone beside me in our king-sized bed, I stared at the ceiling and tried to figure out how to live with the weight of what I now knew about myself. I had spent one night with Harold, but it had revealed years of accumulated loneliness I hadn't even acknowledged. The comfortable routine of my marriage suddenly felt like a prison I had built for myself, room by room, year by year. My phone buzzed with a text message, and my heart jumped before I realized it was just a reminder about a dentist appointment next week. Harold didn't have my cell number, and even if he did, what could he possibly say that wouldn't be dangerous to have in writing? The distance between us felt infinite now, measured not just in miles but in the impossibility of bridging two completely different worlds. He was in his countryside house, probably reading in his study or working in his garden, while I was here in suburbia, surrounded by all the trappings of success that somehow felt hollow now. David's breathing evened out beside me as he drifted off to sleep, his phone still glowing on the nightstand. I reached over to turn it off and caught a glimpse of his calendar for tomorrow: 3 client meetings, a conference call, dinner with the Hendersons. The same kind of schedule that had governed our lives for years, and would continue to govern them for years to come unless something fundamental changed. But what could change? I was 47 years old, financially dependent on David's practice, with no clear idea of what an alternative life might look like. Harold represented possibility, but it was the kind of possibility that required destroying everything stable and secure about my current existence. I thought about the stone in my purse downstairs, about the way Harold had looked at me in those final moments on his porch, about the conversations we'd shared that had made me feel like a person worth knowing. All of it felt precious and fragile, like a beautiful dream that couldn't survive the harsh light of practical considerations. Yet as I finally drifted off to sleep, I found myself making a decision that surprised me with its clarity. I might not know how to change my life dramatically, but I could start small. I could begin paying attention to my own wants and needs instead of automatically deferring to David's preferences. I could reclaim some of the curiosity and creativity that Harold had awakened in me. I could start becoming the woman I had glimpsed in Harold's eyes, someone worth loving for exactly who she was. The first few weeks back in the city passed in a strange haze of hyper-awareness. Every conversation with David felt scripted, every shared meal an exercise in careful performance. I found myself studying our interactions with the detached fascination of an anthropologist, noting patterns I had never seen before. David spoke about his work with passion and detail, but when I mentioned considering taking an art class, his attention immediately drifted to his phone. He planned elaborate dinner parties for his professional contacts but showed little interest in the book I was reading or the local gallery I wanted to visit. The imbalance had always been there, but now I saw it with uncomfortable clarity. Meanwhile, Harold's presence haunted my daily routine in ways both subtle and profound. I found myself pausing at farmers' markets, remembering the care with which he had selected produce. I lingered in bookstores, wondering what titles he might recommend. Simple activities that had once been mere errands became charged with memory and longing. The stone from Harold lived in my purse, and I developed a habit of touching it during particularly difficult moments, when David dismissed something I said without really listening, when I felt invisible at his work functions, when the careful pleasantness of our marriage felt suffocating. The smooth limestone became a talisman, proof that I was capable of inspiring deeper attention from someone who truly saw me. 3 weeks after our return, David announced he needed to make another trip to see a client across the state. Routine business travel that would normally warrant little discussion, but now I felt my pulse quicken at the implications. "How long will you be gone?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. 2 days, maybe 3 if the Peterson contract gets complicated. You don't mind, do you? I know we just got back from vacation. Mind? The prospect of time alone felt like a gift I hadn't dared hope for. Of course not. I might use the time to finally organize the guest room. David nodded approvingly. Good idea. Maybe we should think about having people over more often. Dad mentioned wanting to visit the city. The casual mention of Harold hit me like a physical blow. David continued making plans for his trip, oblivious to my reaction, but all I could think about was the possibility of Harold in our house, sitting at our dining room table, sleeping in our guest room. The thought of him in my carefully controlled domestic space felt both thrilling and terrifying. After David left for his trip, I wandered through our house with new eyes, seeing it as Harold might. The rooms were beautiful in an impersonal way, professionally decorated, perfectly maintained, but lacking the warm accumulation of memories and personal touches that made Harold's house feel alive. This was a showcase, not a home. I found myself in David's study, surrounded by his diplomas and awards, his carefully organized files and pristine desk accessories. Everything spoke of success and control, but nothing revealed the person behind the achievements. Did I know David any better than he knew me? Or had we both become so focused on maintaining the surface of our life together that we'd forgotten to nurture the deeper connection that should have sustained us? That evening, alone in our king-sized bed, I made a decision that felt both inevitable and revolutionary. I drove to the electronics store and bought a phone card, then called Harold from a payphone outside a grocery store like some kind of spy conducting covert operations. His voice answering on the third ring sent warmth flooding through me. Hello? It's me, I said simply. A pause, then, are you all right? David's out of town. I needed to hear your voice. We talked for 20 minutes, covering safe topics, books he was reading, work being done on his garden, my tentative plans to visit local museums. But underneath the ordinary conversation ran a current of everything we couldn't say directly, that we missed each other, that the separation was harder than either had expected, that what had happened between us continued to redefine how we saw our respective lives. I think about you, Harold said finally, his voice soft with admission. I think about you too. Every day. This is complicated. I know. I don't want to be the reason you make decisions you'll regret. The careful kindness of his words made my chest tight. You're not making any decisions for me. But you've helped me see things more clearly. That has to count for something. When we finally said goodbye, I felt both satisfied and desperately lonely. Hearing Harold's voice had reminded me of everything I'd found and lost during our week together. The contrast with my current life felt starker than ever. I drove home through familiar streets that somehow looked different now, as if I were seeing them through new eyes. The neighborhood I had lived in for 8 years as safe, prosperous, predictable, felt like a beautifully appointed waiting room where I had forgotten I was supposed to be going somewhere. David returned from his trip energized and full of plans for expanding his practice. He talked through dinner about new opportunities, potential partnerships, the 5-year growth strategy he was developing. I listened and asked appropriate questions, but part of me was calculating how many years that would mean continuing exactly as we were. "You seem distracted lately," David said as we cleaned up after dinner. "Is everything okay?" The question hung between us, loaded with potential for honesty I wasn't prepared to offer. "I've been thinking about making some changes. Small ones. Maybe taking that art class I mentioned, getting more involved in things that interest me." David nodded approvingly. "That's a great idea. You should have hobbies. It's healthy for couples to have independent interests." Hobbies. As if the creative passion I had suppressed for years was just a pleasant way to fill time between more important obligations. The casual dismissal in his tone made something crystallize in my mind. "What if it's more than a hobby?" I asked carefully. "What if I wanted to get serious about art again?" David's smile became slightly strained. "Well, sure, if it makes you happy. As long as it doesn't interfere with your other responsibilities." Other responsibilities. Managing his social calendar, maintaining our home, being available for his needs and schedule. The life I had built suddenly felt like a very pretty cage, and I was finally seeing the bars. That night, I held Harold's stone in my palm and made another decision. I didn't know yet what form it would take, but I was going to start living for myself instead of just supporting someone else's dreams. Harold had awakened something in me that demanded to be honored, and I was finally ready to listen to what it was trying to tell me. The problem was, I had no idea how to do that without destroying everything I had spent years building. The crisis began with something as ordinary as a misdelivered package. I was in the garden, finally planting the herbs I had been meaning to buy for months, when the delivery truck pulled up to our driveway. The driver approached with a package addressed to David but bearing Harold's return address. My hands were literally shaking as I signed for it, and I spent the rest of the afternoon staring at the box like it might explode. What could Harold possibly be sending to David? They had no ongoing correspondence that I knew of, no shared interests that would warrant parcels being mailed between them. When David came home that evening, I handed him the package with what I hoped was casual interest. "This came for you today." David examined the return address with surprise. "From Dad? Wonder what this could be." He opened it at the kitchen table while I pretended to focus on preparing dinner, my heart hammering so hard I was certain he could hear it. Inside was a first edition of a book on business ethics that Harold had apparently remembered David mentioning during our visit, along with a brief note about finding it at a local bookshop and thinking David might enjoy it. "That's thoughtful of him," David said, flipping through the pages. "I mentioned this book to him weeks ago. Didn't think he was paying attention. A perfectly innocent gift between stepfather and stepson, but I felt like I was reading between lines that might not even exist. Was this Harold's way of maintaining connection with our household? Was he thinking about our week together every time he wrote David's address? Or was I projecting meaning onto what was simply a kind gesture from a man who paid attention to what people said they wanted? The uncertainty was maddening. I found myself analyzing every aspect of the package, the careful handwriting, the choice of book, the timing of its arrival. It felt like trying to decode a message that might or might not have been intended for me. David set the book aside and moved on to other topics, but I spent the evening hyper-aware of its presence on the kitchen counter. When he went upstairs to shower, I picked it up and examined it more closely, looking for any additional notes or markings that might be meant for me. There were none, of course. It was exactly what it appeared to be, a thoughtful gift from a literary man to his stepson. But that night, as David read beside me in bed, I found myself staring at the book on his nightstand and wondering if Harold had touched those same pages, if he had thought of me while selecting it from the bookshop shelf. The possibility felt both thrilling and torturous. Over the following weeks, the package became a symbol of the impossible distance between Harold and me. We existed in each other's lives only through such tangential connections, shared memories of David, polite family obligations, the careful choreography of maintaining normal relationships. There was no direct communication, no way to bridge the gap between what we had shared and what we were allowed to acknowledge. I started paying closer attention to David's interactions with Harold, listening for mentions of phone calls or emails that might give me some sense of how Harold was doing. But their relationship remained exactly as it had always been, warm but infrequent contact, limited to practical matters and holiday greetings. The isolation was beginning to affect my daily life in ways I couldn't control. I found myself distracted during conversations, checking my phone obsessively for messages that would never come, driving past bookshops and farmers' markets with a longing that felt almost physical. David noticed my moodiness but attributed it to what he called midlife restlessness and suggested I make an appointment with my doctor to discuss hormone replacement therapy. The suggestion infuriated me in ways I couldn't safely express. The idea that my newfound awareness of what was missing from my life could be dismissed as a medical condition felt like the ultimate invalidation of everything I had discovered about myself. I don't think this is medical, I told him carefully. I think I'm just ready for some changes in my life. What kind of changes? It was a reasonable question, but I had no reasonable answer. What I wanted was Harold, his attention, his conversation, his way of seeing me as someone worth knowing deeply. But I couldn't say that. What I wanted was to feel alive and valued and intellectually engaged. But I wasn't sure how to achieve that within the constraints of my current life. I don't know yet, I admitted. But I'm going to figure it out. David's expression grew concerned. You're not thinking of doing anything drastic, are you? Because if you're having some kind of crisis, we should talk about it. Maybe see a counselor together. The word crisis hung between us like an accusation. Was that what this was? A crisis? Or was it simply the natural result of years of living without examining whether I was happy or just comfortable? I'm not having a crisis, I said firmly. I'm having an awakening. But even as I spoke the words, I wondered if there was really a difference. That weekend, David went to play golf with clients, and I found myself driving aimlessly through neighborhoods I'd never explored, looking for something I couldn't name. I ended up at an art supply store, wandering the aisles and touching brushes and canvases with the reverence of someone returning to a long-lost language. I bought a basic set of watercolors and a pad of heavy paper, then drove to a park and spent 2 hours trying to capture the way afternoon light fell across a stand of oak trees. The painting was amateur and clumsy, but the act of creating something with my own hands felt revolutionary after years of managing other people's needs and schedules. When David came home and saw my supplies spread across the kitchen table, he smiled indulgently. How was your art experiment? Wonderful, I said simply, but something in my tone made him look at me more closely. You seem different lately. More. I don't know. Intense. He wasn't wrong. I did feel more intense, more present, more aware of what I wanted and needed. The question was whether our marriage could accommodate this new version of myself, or whether I would have to choose between growth and security. That night, I sat on our back deck with my watercolors and tried to paint Harold's garden from memory. The results were imperfect, but they captured something essential about that space, the careful attention to beauty, the sense of abundance and peace, the feeling of being truly at home. When I finally went inside, I found David asleep in front of the television, his laptop open beside him, work emails glowing on the screen even during his supposed downtime. Looking at him there, I felt a complicated mixture of affection and sadness. He was a good man in many ways, but we had built a life that left no room for the person I was becoming. I covered him with a throw blanket and turned off the television, then went upstairs to our bedroom alone. In the darkness, I held Harold's stone and tried to imagine what he was doing at that moment. Reading probably, or working in his garden under the stars, or sitting on his porch listening to the night sounds of the countryside. The distance between us felt unbridgeable, but for the first time, I began to consider what it might cost to bridge it anyway. The unraveling began with David's phone buzzing on the breakfast table while he was in the shower. Normally, I would have ignored it, but the name on the screen made my blood freeze, Harold. I stared at the phone as it continued to ring, my heart hammering against my ribs. Harold never called David. Their relationship was warm but distant, maintained through holiday cards and the occasional email. Why would he be calling now, at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning? The ringing stopped, then immediately started again. Same name, same gut-wrenching awareness that something was wrong. This time I answered without thinking. Hello? Oh. Harold's voice, surprised but pleased. I was trying to reach David. He's in the shower. Is everything okay? A pause, and in that silence I could hear everything we weren't allowed to say, how much we'd missed each other, how many times we'd started to call, how the separation had felt like a physical ache that wouldn't heal. I'm moving, Harold said finally. Permanently. I wanted David to know before he heard it from someone else. The words hit me like a physical blow. Moving. Permanently. The small thread that had connected us, however tenuously, was about to be severed forever. Moving where? I managed to ask. My sister in Oregon. She's been asking me to relocate closer to family, and I've decided it's time. I'm putting the house on the market next week. The house. Our house, where we had discovered each other, where I had finally felt truly alive. He was selling it, packing up all those memories and carrying them across the country to a place I would never see. When? My voice came out as a whisper. The movers come Friday. I'll be driving out next weekend. 5 days. Less than a week before he disappeared from my world entirely. I heard David's footsteps on the stairs and knew I had only seconds before everything became exponentially more complicated. David's coming down. I'll tell him you called. Wait. Harold's voice was urgent. I need you to know what happened between us, what we shared. It changed everything for me. It made me realize I was living half a life, and I can't do that anymore. I hope you understand. David appeared in the kitchen, toweling his hair and looking curious about who had called so early. I ended the call without responding to Harold's words, but they echoed in my head as I handed David his phone. Your stepfather called. He wants to talk to you about something important. David immediately called Harold back, and I listened to the one-sided conversation with growing dread. Surprise at the news, concern about Harold's decision to move so far away, offers to help with the logistics. Normal family responses to unexpected news, but all I could think about was Harold packing up his life and carrying it beyond my reach forever. That's sudden, David said after ending the call. He seemed really determined though. Said he needed a fresh start somewhere new. A fresh start. The phrase cut through me like a blade. Harold was moving on, building a new life, while I remained trapped in the same patterns that had been slowly suffocating me for years. That day passed in a blur of ordinary activities that felt surreal given the magnitude of what I had learned. I went through the motions of my usual routine: grocery shopping, laundry, dinner preparation, while my mind spun with the implications of Harold's departure. By evening, I knew I had to do something. I couldn't let him leave without acknowledging what we had meant to each other, without saying goodbye properly. The thought of him driving away forever, carrying our secret with him into his new life, felt unbearable. While David worked in his study, I slipped outside and called Harold from my cell phone, walking to the end of our driveway where I couldn't be overheard. "I had to call," I said when he answered. "I couldn't let you leave without talking." "I know. I've been hoping you would. Why didn't you tell me you were thinking about moving?" "Because I knew it would hurt you, and I didn't want to cause you more pain than I already have." The kindness in his voice made tears sting my eyes. Even now, even as he was leaving forever, he was trying to protect me. "I don't understand," I said. "Why now? Why so suddenly?" Harold was quiet for a long moment. "Because staying here, being this close to you while not being able to be with you, it's killing me slowly. I wake up every morning thinking about calling you, and I go to sleep every night remembering how it felt to hold you. I can't live like that anymore." His honesty took my breath away. While I had been struggling to manage my feelings within the constraints of my marriage, he had been fighting the same battle with even higher stakes. He had no spouse to consider, no elaborate life structure to protect. He was free to choose, and he was choosing to run rather than live with the pain of wanting what he couldn't have. "What if you didn't have to live like that?" I heard myself saying. "What if there was another way?" "What are you suggesting?" The question hung between us, loaded with possibilities that terrified and exhilarated me in equal measure. What was I suggesting? That I leave David? That I throw away 8 years of marriage and start over at 47 with a man who was planning to move across the country? The practical obstacles seemed insurmountable. But the alternative, watching Harold drive away while I remained in my carefully constructed prison, felt impossible too. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I know I can't lose you. Not like this. Not forever. You're married." "I know. This would destroy David." "I know that too." "And you're still willing to consider it?" The question forced me to confront the truth I had been avoiding for weeks. Was I willing to sacrifice everything stable and secure about my life for the chance to be with Harold? Was I brave enough to choose uncertainty and potential happiness over the safe misery of my current existence? "I think I am," I said softly. "I think I have to be." We talked for another 20 minutes, not making plans but acknowledging possibilities. When I finally hung up, I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down at a drop that would either destroy me or teach me how to fly. David was still working when I came back inside, oblivious to the seismic shift occurring just outside his awareness. I sat on our couch, surrounded by all the trappings of the life we had built together, and tried to imagine what it would feel like to walk away from it all. Scary. Liberating. Devastating. Revolutionary. All of it, all at once. I had 3 days to decide whether I was brave enough to jump.